In one of my other shipwreck videos, I covered the destroyer Nizuki, an Akizuki-class ship most famous for, possibly, having the longest range torpedo hit in history. That wreck was in pretty decent shape, as these ships go. Today we'll be looking at her sister ship, Wakatsuki. This wreck is the exact opposite. While not the worst wreck I've covered, this is still a mess. The hull is broken, and the weaponry is scattered. There's surprisingly little sea life, but the condition is still rough. This is a ship that shows every bit how violent her sinking was. However, before we get to that, we have the traditional sinking overview. That took place in the meat grinder that was Ormoc Bay. Several ships on both sides were lost in this area. Shimikaze, for example, is probably the most famous loss. Wakatsuki was lost in the same action. That came on November 11th, 1944. Around 10:45 a.m., American aircraft descended on the Japanese. These included Shimikaze, Naganami, Hamanami, and of course Wakatsuki. Details of this attack are rather vague, but Wakatsuki was probably stationary by around 11:30. The destroyer was burning from stem to stern and listing to starboard. The bow section was already beginning to slip beneath the waves, while the stern turrets were trained in opposite directions. By 11:40, those fires reached something explosive, either a magazine or the torpedoes. Either way, this explosion was incredibly violent. The destroyer went up in a plume of smoke and fire before rolling over and sinking. Unsurprisingly, most of the crew went down with the ship. Like with Shimikaze, exactly how many men survived is an open question. There were 131 survivors plucked from the water between the two destroyers. Japanese records being what they are, there's no indication how many came from either ship. At least not that I'm aware of. Regardless, this is where Wakatsuki's story came to an end. Her wreck wasn't exactly a famous one, so it would remain undiscovered for many years to come. It would, in fact, only be located in December of 2017 by the usual suspects. Paul Allen's team on RV Petrel, who were surveying the Ormoc Bay wrecks at the time. Wakatsuki's wreck was found at a depth of 265 meters, or 869 feet. This makes the destroyer one of the shallower wrecks located by Petrel, and the wreck certainly shows it with far more rusted out metal than something like Indianapolis. Let's look at that wreck now, technically starting with the sonar, but only briefly. All we have here is the outline of the destroyer. There's not a detailed side scan look in this case. So, we'll move on to the wreck itself, beginning here with the bow, or what's left of it. This is laying on its starboard side and is pretty heavily covered in silt. Looking towards the bottom, in fact, you can barely make out where the seabed ends and the ship begins. Wakatsuki is buried pretty deeply. Even so, you can still make out the shape of the bow. Here, for example, you can see the shape sticking out. And here, I believe, is where the deck would be, judging from the cabling, which is probably degaussing wire. That's also pretty hard to make out. The only other detail in this picture is the anchor right here, which is far clearer in the next image. The anchor is still fixed in place and intact. The silt and sea life does make picking out any details almost impossible, but there isn't any visible damage. There's some crumpled metal next to it here, but the anchor itself seems fine. You can't really say that for the rest of the bow. The degaussing cable, for instance, breaks off and falls over the deck. And here, well, the bow is completely broken. It's a jagged tear in the side of the ship before falling away to scattered debris. While I'd say a torpedo explosion is fairly likely, I wouldn't rule out a magazine explosion here either. It might well have been both, looking at this damage, and the condition of the main gun mounts for that matter, but we'll get to that later. First, we have the boat davits here. This would have been just aft of the funnel, as seen here on Harutsuki. That funnel is long gone on Wakatsuki, or if it survived, it wasn't photographed. As for the davit, it's still in place and pointing towards the bottom. Although this is actually pointing inboard. so this is angled to what would have been the deck. This part of Wakatsuki was completely destroyed, with only a little bit of the side and deck still recognizable. Whatever's left of the deck is completely buried in the seabed. The next picture of the other davit is what makes that apparent. This one is rotated in the opposite direction, pointing outboard, and you can tell that because the degaussing wire on the side of the ship is visible once more. The socket for the davit is also visible, resting on the extreme edge of the deck, which seems to have buckled here right beneath it, and then comes to an end further down. Just like the last picture, the deck is pretty ruined in this area. So, without much else to see beyond the davit and the peaks at the deck, let's move on. This doesn't get much better with the next picture. Exactly where this is on the ship isn't immediately apparent. There's no gun mounts, no torpedo tubes, and nothing else to identify the area. So this could be just about anywhere other than the extreme bow that we already saw. What's notable about this, in any case, is the way the hull is buckled out. You can see the degaussing cable again at the top of the buckled bit. That means we're looking at the deck here. So this part of the ship is flattened into the bottom, with the deck mostly gone. And the side has been completely blown out, with it buckled quite high up. Although it's not immediately obvious what actually caused this. I would guess the hull was bowed out here from the explosion, whatever and wherever that was. That doesn't rule out it being from the impact with the bottom. There's not really a way to tell for sure on the available evidence. Whatever caused this, it's not a pretty sight. And the next bit is even worse in that regard. Petrel notes this as the aft end of the largest intact wreckage. That wording, and looking at the picture on screen, should tell you what the less intact bits are going to look like. But for this picture, we have the stern of the ship. Not the extreme stern, which seems to be missing, because this, right here, would appear to be a broken propeller shaft. Looking at the mounting, this broke pretty far back along the shaft, with no sign of the prop itself. In fact, there's very little left here in general. The one shaft, the hole immediately around it, and not much else. Much like with the davits, most of Wakatsuki is missing, leaving one distinctive feature surrounded by broken metal. Judging from the way the metal is broken, here and here, it looks like the stern broke off pretty violently. Considering Petrel didn't make note of finding the stern, it must have broken off fairly high up, and drifted quite a bit away from the rest of the ship. Or, alternatively, the depth charges went up too, and blew it to pieces. I can't say for sure. So, with that done, we can now look at the weaponry, which is where Wakatsuki really breaks from Nizuki in terms of condition. If you watched that video, you'll remember that Nizuki's gun mounts were pretty recognizable. Rusted out, yes, but still mostly there. That cannot be said for her sister ship. Here we have two of the mounts sitting on their own between the bow and the main section of the hull. It's this right here that makes me think of a magazine explosion. This area of the ship is completely destroyed. As for the mounts, they barely qualify as intact. The one in the background is generally better. Most of this side is still intact, while the area here is completely gone. Only the framework remains. There also seems to be two major holes, one at the bottom and one further up. The other mount, for its part, is resting on its side. I believe this is the bottom here, with the doors on the back missing. There's also some pretty serious rusting, with much of the side gone. The mounts on an Akizuki aren't made of the thickest metal, and this demonstrates that pretty well. As for the interior, there isn't much visible there. Whatever's left of the guns is either out of frame or completely gone. And the side of the ship here isn't exactly much better. It's broken and rusted out. The next picture, meanwhile, shows the front of the upside-down mount. One of the barrels is barely visible, buried in the silt, and the mount's face is mostly intact. Some is missing here, but much of the metal remains. There aren't really any details to make out, but it's in decent enough shape. The bit next to it is more rusted out. I can't tell for sure, but it might be the other mount. If so, these are basically resting on top of each other. Unfortunately, things don't get better with the other mounts. If anything, they get worse. This one here is pretty ruined. The barrels are on the side and the bottom, and the mount itself is rusted out. There's not much left here other than broken wreckage, with the barrels the only recognizable part. Even those are completely overgrown where they're not buried, as you can tell here from the front. If we assume they're still in the mount itself, it means much of that is under the seabed. What little we can see doesn't give much indication in either direction. And yet, this is still not the worst mount. That's this one, because there's no mount visible at all. There's just the two 10cm barrels poking out of the mud, with anything else buried beneath Wakatsuki's hull. I'm not sure if that means these fell out of the mount, or if that means the mount fell off and was buried beneath the ship, because this looks like deck here, not the bottom of the destroyer. If the mount ended up buried, with just the barrels poking out, that's a first for me, and another sign of how rough this ship is. In any case, that rounds off the recognizable wreckage. There's a couple more pictures of less recognizable debris. Here we have scattered metal, broken and twisted, with a shell casing in the foreground. That's the only part that I can say with certainty what it is. The rest is too torn up. And here we have what Petrel notes as the forward part of the main wreckage. This area is also pretty torn up, with the side of the ship falling down. There's nothing to indicate where exactly it is. Which brings us to the last picture here. This might be another angle on the first two gun mounts. It looks similar to that area, and Petrel identified this as a mount. But it's difficult to say for sure. There's a couple holes here, and there's some more wreckage here. Beyond that though, not much. Still, it seems a good point to end the video, as a final demonstration of how torn up Wakatsuki is. It's a toss-up, I think, between her and Shimikaze, on which Ormoc wreck I've covered is in worse shape. The other two, Hamanami and Naganami, don't have much to look at. I'll still probably cover them at some point. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.